Setting up. All right. Hello, Facebook fans. We are about to get started with this great conversation on the past and present of food justice in America. So I'm going to go ahead and take down our little screen here and introduce you to our guests. Hi. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. If you're just joining, feel free to put into the comments, where you're joining from, what part of the world that you're in. If you have any questions for us, we will be taking questions throughout the conversation. So drop those in the comments, whether you're streaming this live from the Made by Us Facebook page or the National Museum of American History or Food Forward. So we are here today with our two guests. Myself, Caroline Klibanoff, I'm with Made by Us, and I'll share with you a little bit more about what it is that we do momentarily. But for those of you just tuning in, we're getting started, and I will introduce you to our guests, Celia and Ashley. And we are so excited for the conversation that we're going to have today. Welcome, you guys.
Thanks for having us.
Hello.
So let me go ahead and get started with some introductions so that everyone can, feel like we're all in the same room together here for this conversation on the past and present and future, actually, of food justice, food access, and what it means to have a future that is just around the issue of food in the United States. So we're here with Dr. Ashley Rose Young. She is the historian of the American Food History Project at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. She's the host and historian of Cooking Up History, the museum's cooking demonstration series. So if you didn't know that they do that, they do. It's very cool. And she has also curated the museum's main food history exhibition, which is called Food, Transforming the American Table. She's currently working on her first academic book about the history of street food in New Orleans. So cool. And it's a story of how power operated in unexpected ways through the networks of exchange that fed the city. Ashley earned a PhD in history from Duke University, an MA in history from Duke University, a BA in history from Yale University, and she was also a visiting scholar at Oxford. Thank you, Ashley, for being here. We're so excited. We're also joined by Celia Cody Carisi. She's the Outreach and Communications Coordinator at Food Forward. And if you don't know what Food Forward is, we are going to dig into that today, so you will be learning all about it. Celia spreads the organization's mission and work through online communications, community outreach, and volunteer engagement. She grew up in Oakland, California, where she developed her sense of justice and love for the outdoors. She moved to Los Angeles to pursue a degree in geography and environmental studies at UCLA. And after graduating, she joined the team at Food Forward to help make fresh fruits and vegetables accessible to all Angelenos. Is that how you pronounce people in Los Angeles?
Angelenos.
Angelenos, yeah. Here with our East Coast bias. Yes, we're so glad to have you, Celia, and excited to hear about Food Forward and all the great work that you all do. So I just wanted to take a minute to introduce all of our viewers, listeners, however you're streaming this, to a little bit of backstory of how this came about. The Smithsonian National Museum of American History in DC does a great weekend every year called Food History Weekend. And it's really amazing. You can learn about all types of foodways and food history and cooking demonstrations. And it's really an amazing mix of people that come together for this annual event. And this year they pivoted to do that virtually. So Ashley was a big part of making that all happen. And the National Museum of American History is also one of the leaders of this new initiative called Made by Us. That's where I am the program manager. Made by Us is bringing together history museums and sites all across the country to connect millennials and Gen Z with history as a tool for civic engagement. So Made by Us really thrives when we're bringing together the history people and the civic participation people to be in the same conversation, in the same room, lending a historical context to the work that we're doing now and lending a civic action component to the rich history that our country has. So for me, bringing together groups like Food Forward and the Smithsonian is just a perfect match when you have so much expertise to share with all of us. So thank you again for being here. I will let you speak shortly. I will just wanted to remind all of our viewers, you can ask questions of our guests in the comments. And if you have any questions along the way, we will get to those after we dig in to the conversation a little bit. So let's see. One thing I wanted to kick off the conversation with before I give a little more context about a project that we worked on is to ask you, Celia, to tell us a little bit about what Food Forward does so all of our listeners can be clear on your mission.
Yeah, so Food Forward is a nonprofit organization in Southern California. Our mission is to fight hunger and prevent food waste by rescuing fresh surplus produce that would otherwise go to waste and connecting it with local hunger relief organizations. So we do that by recovering produce from backyard fruit trees, farmers markets, and the downtown LA wholesale produce district, which is where a ton of produce that goes to grocery stores and restaurants comes through every day. So we collect this produce that would otherwise go to waste and then donate it to organizations that are feeding people across Southern California. And we, to date, we've recovered over 100 million pounds of fruits and vegetables in the past 11 years. We work with about 1,800 hunger relief organizations in Southern California and donate 100% of the produce free of charge and help to feed about 2 million people every year.
Wow. It's really amazing impact. I know that this is an issue, year round, certainly, but it's something that's been on everyone's minds, especially in the holiday season. So earlier this summer, Made by Us asked Americans all across the country to share their vision for the country's future. And we collected these on a site called My Wish for Us. And essentially what we heard were wishes of all kinds. Obviously, there's been visions for the future related to public health, due to the pandemic, for racial equality and justice. But we did see quite a lot of wishes that were tied to food justice. So I just wanted to kind of set the tone for our conversation here with some of these wishes for the future that we've seen. So we heard from people from all ages, from all parts of the country, different aspects of, the broad food issue. Can we have access to healthy food and quality healthcare? Can we live in a world where people are connected to their food, where there's respect for the farmers and the planet and their own body? I mean, to me, that's so multifaceted. It's not just food on the table, but it's food in your body. Where does it come from? And who's working to give us access to that? We certainly saw wishes related to food service workers, in the age where we're putting essential workers on the front lines. That's something that comes up. And a future in which no one is hungry, food is safe to eat, and those in the food system can earn a living wage. Really powerful stuff. I'll leave these up on the screen for a few minutes while we chat. But the interesting part for me was that all of these issues have a rich history. Whether you're talking about even something like food safety, there's such a long history to get to the point where we know what food is safe to eat, regulations that were put into place. So as we talk through our conversation today, just wanted to have these visions for the future front of mind. And I think Ashley, you actually did share your wish, your vision for America's future tied to food justice. Is there anything you would add to this?
Well, these responses, as you pointed out, are just so beautiful. And I think, my wish, I'm trying to remember the exact wording of it, but it was along the lines of, having a food system that supports nutrient-dense, affordable, safe culturally appropriate foods for everyone. And then also there's that labor component, that the individuals who are growing our food, who are distributing our food, who are getting it to us are also safe and paid fairly for their wages. So very much along the lines of a broad concept of food justice, where really tracking the system from farm to table, that individuals who contribute to that and partake in it are happy, healthy, and safe.
Absolutely. Celia, when you look at these visions for the future related to food security and access, given your work at Food Forward, is this an increased emphasis is it due to the pandemic? I mean, how has the pandemic shaped that need and that, that it's on people's minds, the public awareness of this issue?
Yeah, I definitely think the pandemic has had an impact on how people are thinking about this and how much they're thinking about this. I mean, it's kind of hard to not see the impact that the pandemic has had on food access. A lot of us have seen videos of, miles of cars lined up to, receive food assistance at a food bank, or heard stories of people waking up at 4 a.m. to get in line so that they can make sure they have food for their family. So, it's not just the pandemic itself, but really the economic situation. So, when people are unemployed and underemployed, they are more likely to be food insecure. And often people choose to pay for things like rent or utilities or medical bills before they pay for food, because losing your housing, and especially during a pandemic, losing your housing is such a huge risk. So I think that, we also have numbers that back this up. Food insecurity has been really high throughout the pandemic. I actually just read that it's at its worst right now, which is likely due to the sort of running out of government benefits that a lot of people were relying on, as well as, there's more shutdowns that are happening now as the pandemic is getting worse, as it's getting colder. So in early November, 1 in 8 Americans, or 26 million people, reported not being able to have enough food sometimes or often during the week. And for families with children, that was 1 in 6. So, that's really high. Those are really high numbers. We normally are more at 1 in 11 across the country. So it's a huge uptick. And yeah, I think it's really a lot more visible now than it was before the pandemic.
Those are really staggering numbers. And yet, we know this. These are friends, neighbors, it's not confined. Obviously, certain groups are more affected than others, but it's something that we can see all around us in our communities. So, Celia, just for our listeners, and even for myself, what does it mean to be food insecure? What is that, what does that look like?
Yeah, so food insecurity is essentially just not having access to enough good, culturally appropriate, and healthy food. And then if you are food insecure, you have enough access. So I think about it as, do I have to worry about how I'm going to pay for my next meal? Am I having to, forego other costs to pay for it? Am I myself, not eating food so my kids can eat? So those are all kind of ways that food insecurity manifests. And I think also, when we think about these things of good, culturally appropriate, healthy, those are subjective. So it's not up to one person or the government to decide this is culturally appropriate for you. Like, that's up to an individual to decide what is food security to them.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in many ways, food is so fraught. It's like the most complex thing that we can talk about here, because it brings in culture, it brings in justice, it brings in law, health and regulation, all of the above. Ashley, we know you're a historian. We know these issues are not new, and maybe we never had the term food insecurity until, I don't know when, I assume recently, but are there times this has come up before, and when this issue has been front and center for people?
Yeah, so looking at food and food access, I mean, these are issues that have marred the history of Homo sapiens since the beginning. I mean, if you think about this in terms of regulation and law, you might want to bring that more into a history in which you have cities, you have governing bodies, you have these rules in place that, based on xenophobia or race or sexism, that might create inequitable laws that prevent individuals from accessing affordable food, or might force them into industries with really with terrible labor practices, or with issues in terms of the salaries they raise, and thus they're not able to afford healthy, affordable food. So, this is something that we've dealt with throughout time. I'm thinking about my book project, which is about New Orleans and looks at the city's history and its food culture, largely in the 1800s. And what's interesting back then was that there was this concept that stemmed from a long tradition, going back to Europe, of moral economy. There was this idea that the government should have a role in distributing and regulating safe, healthy, and affordable food. And you see that with the creation of municipal markets, where people could go and trust that the food there was regulated by the government, that there would be price controls so that it wouldn't be outlandishly expensive, and that there was a sense of public health and safety. But that kind of system really fell out of popularity in the 1850s and 60s as capitalism took an even stronger hold in US culture, and you start having more and more competition from private grocers, private distributors, where capitalism really becomes king. And as we know, capitalism is about sustaining businesses economically and about making a profit. And so this idea of the moral economy, an economy for the good of the people, really starts to kind of corrode away as we move into the 20th century. And so we start to see the effects of that in our urban food cultures, in rural food cultures. But I think about 1969 with the Black Panther Party starting an effort to have breakfasts served across the country for hungry children, whose families are in situations where they can't access affordable, safe food. So you have that movement, really grassroots oriented. I think about Alice Waters in 1995, starting the Edible Schoolyard and really trying to have this movement to educate our youth and educate people on how food grows, what nutritious means, what it means to them. And we've seen, over the years, by 2015, there were over 40,000 schools across the country partaking in this garden education, this kind of edible schoolyard education, trying to bring back these historic ways of knowing how food grows and how it benefits the body. So, it's a very complex story, as you said, but I wanted to point out that capitalism has a role to play in the issues that our food system has today. And there have always been grassroots movements, especially among marginalized communities, to really mitigate the effects of capitalism on our food access.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like we all just went to class. This is so useful to have the context. I mean, and I'm so glad you brought up the Black Panthers, because, for example, on the mywishforus.com website, where you can explore visions for the country's future, we also included historical wishes, people in the past who had some vision for the future. And we have a wish from the founders of the Black Panthers saying, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. And like, they begin with land and bread. I mean, it's so core to what it takes to get by. I just thought that was really, really interesting. So Celia, in your work, have you seen, essentially, it sounds like, Ashley, you're saying, we have this long history of needing things from the government. We need regulation, we need help, we need support. But along the way, the people are doing it for themselves. And a group like Food Forward seems to be doing just that. So Celia, is this something you've bumped up against, that you're doing this grassroots on the ground work, even amid a system that maybe isn't built for that?
Yeah, I think that, Food Forward is kind of working to try to, we're working within a broken system, right? Like, we have this situation where 40% of our food that we produce is going to waste. And, during this pandemic, 1 in 8 Americans don't have access to enough food. It's not that there's not enough food that we're growing. We have enough food to feed everyone, but we don't have the, you know, like Ashley was saying, another effect of capitalism is the way that our food system works is not designed to feed everyone. It's designed to make the most profit. And so that means that, you know, there's often issues with supply and demand and distribution, and things just get wasted because that's less expensive than, you know, that's cheaper than trying to figure out a system where we can feed everybody. So, so that's the system that we're working in to try to kind of, you know, fix some of those, you know, create some bridges between that food that's would go to waste and organizations. And I think that also, you know, Food Forward is one organization working, but I think that in terms of, you know, grassroots organizations that are really working within this broken system, there's so many amazing organizations that are doing work, and I'm really interested in a lot of the mutual aid work that's going on right now, especially during the pandemic, and just how, you know, really grassroots efforts, which the Black Panthers is a really great example of that mutual aid, of just people in the community saying, like, hey, our kids don't have enough food, so we're going to do it ourselves. And we've seen these community fridges that are popping up around the country in places like New York and LA and other cities. We're seeing people who are just, you know, kind of doing it themselves and figuring out how to get enough food to their neighbors, and also saying that, you know, it's not charity or a handout, it's let me help you, let's you help me, like we're in this together, which I think is really, really inspiring and a great kind of vision for how we can transform our food system.
Yeah, it is inspiring, and it's also, you know, not surprising in a way. Food is a non-negotiable for people. People need to eat. So I'm looking forward to hearing more of these examples that I know you both have of groups that are doing this kind of work. But I just wanted to get clear on what does food justice mean when we're talking about food as an issue of justice? Social justice, economic justice. I mean, even this ties into environmental justice. What does that future actually look like? Celia, can you explain for us?
Yeah, so the definition we use at Food Forward is that food justice is a holistic and structural view of the food system that sees healthy food as a human right and addresses structural barriers to that right. So it's a lens to see how people, you know, how different people do or don't have access to healthy foods and what's going on underneath that. So it's, you know, it's saying this is not random. This is not just, oh, you know, well, you worked harder than this other person, so that's why you can afford food. It's looking at the underlying systemic issues that are creating that inequity. So it's looking at issues like racism and economic oppression and, you know, so many other issues that affect how people do or don't have access to food. And it's also not just looking at consumers, but, you know, like Ashley also mentioned, the entire food system. So how are workers being impacted? You know, it's sort of a moral issue that our farm workers often can't afford the food that they grow, right? So there's a clear issue there. And that's also not by accident that they're not paid a living wage. So, you know, from farm workers to grocery store workers to, you know, folks who work in restaurants, sort of how does our entire food system work? And then, as you mentioned, the environmental justice piece as well, what's happening to our land? How does our agriculture system contribute to, you know, pollution and environmental racism and injustice in that way? So there's a lot that is connected.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it's good to understand kind of the systemic framework around these issues. I mean, at Made by Us, what we always try to do is help people recognize that understanding the system involves understanding some of the history, like some of what came before. Ashley, when you think about food justice, how do you bring history into the equation?
I mean, for me, it's there already, because where we are today is just kind of the end result of hundreds of years, of decades of government policies, of, you know, social norms, of systemic racism, of sexism in our system. And so you see people who are pushed to the margins, who are marginalized in these political arenas, in these economic arenas. A consequence of that is that they also lose access to food, to that healthy, fresh food. And because we eat every day, or that's the goal, that we have the opportunity to eat healthful food every day, it is so much a part of who we are, not just sustaining our bodies, but our sense of self. You know, it's the time that some people have to come together, to share stories, to learn from one another, to just build those important connections. And so I'm always interested in how we got to where we are today. And you see, it is so deeply connected to our past. And we have to untangle those webs. We have to identify those particular laws and policies so that we don't make those same mistakes again. And also to look to the past and recognize that people have been resisting these inequities for a very long time, and that they have implemented different educational programs. They have, created opportunities for different kinds of labor that are more fairly compensated. Like, we have examples of this throughout history. So looking back is not only a way to look at our mistakes, but to look at a way for a solution moving forward. So the past is really fertile ground to dive into and build a better future.
Yeah, absolutely. And well said. If you're just tuning in, we are joined here by Celia and Ashley. Celia is with Food Forward, and Ashley is with the National Museum of American History. And we are discussing the past, present, and future of food justice in America, something that comes to mind a lot, with the holiday season. And there is sort of cultural activity happening around food and eating, but also this is a year-round issue, food insecurity for many Americans. And something that's been exacerbated by the pandemic and the economic fallout from the pandemic. So if you're just tuning in, please feel free to add your questions into the comments. We will get to them, definitely. And we have more to talk about still. So I did want to make sure we got to, talking about the holiday season. Thanksgiving was last week, a fraught holiday of its own, really. And, I was thinking earlier in the conversation, I said, food is fraught, and it is, but it's also so rich. It's one of the best things we have in this country is the many, many foodways of all the people that have shaped our country's past and present. So, I know that these holidays can bring the food access issue front and center for many Americans. But they all are building on this history of the way people have gotten by. And both of you have pointed to examples of people finding a way, despite whatever the system is doing, people are finding a way to feed themselves, to feed their communities, to feed their children. So, Ashley, are there some examples, and you've already shared many with us, but are there any more examples you can point to of the types of mutual aid that Celia was talking about, or examples where communities have developed foodways, even just out of hardship, for example?
Yeah, so in my work, I've come to discover that some of the most flavorful and meaningful dishes are ones born out of tremendous struggle. So specifically, I'm thinking about the foodways of African Americans, from individuals, especially looking back in the colonial period, to people who were forcibly brought from Africa to the United States, many of them bringing really sophisticated knowledge, agricultural knowledge systems with them, gardening knowledges, and they're thrown into this horrific slave society in North and South America. And many of them had the opportunity to, or were forced to, cultivate their own gardens to feed themselves, in addition to getting some basic necessities from slave owners. But what you see out of that is this independence, that in these garden plots, they're cultivating, they're gathering seeds, they're cultivating knowledges, they're feeding themselves and sustaining themselves on really nutrient dense foods like black-eyed peas and okra. And often, there'd be opportunities to take some of that produce from their gardens in New Orleans, for example, in the 1800s, taking that to the city center and selling it to accrue some profit, right, to a very small amount. But I think about street foods like kebab, they're sugary rice fritters, right? And these are made from leftover rice. They involve some sugar, some aromatic spices, and can be sold on the streets. Many of the people who sold them were enslaved African women. And there are stories over time of some of these women accruing enough profit over decades of work to purchase their own freedom or that of a family member. So you see this empowerment through food and by repurposing what was considered to be leftovers to transform their lives, to gain their freedom. So, that's just one example, but I think about a lot of just staple foods, beans and rice, corn and tortillas, these staple foods made from beans, corn, really nutrient dense proteins, okra and other vegetables that are not necessarily eating quote unquote high on the hog, but really form the core of so many foodways across this country.
That's really, really interesting. I'm sure we can all think of so many examples in our own communities and backgrounds of different kinds where, new traditions have been developed out of exactly that. I mean, even in the pandemic alone, have we all not experienced, stores being out of certain things? I know there's been shortages of different kinds, or you can't get there to this, during the regular hours because you're working and you have kids are at home. So, whether or not you had experienced that before and thought of it as something, in history, maybe many more Americans are experiencing it now, and many have all along. So, Celia, when you think about this, I know that Food Forward focuses on bringing fresh fruits and vegetables to people. How are you working to improve these things? And have you seen any examples of people kind of stretching into new territories or creating new circumstances out of the hand that we've been dealt?
I think there has been a really incredible response to such a terrible situation that we're in from people in our communities and from grassroots folks. At Food Forward, we've worked with over 100 new partners just this year, some of whom may have been existing organizations, but a lot of whom are just new organizations that sprang up out of this need to increase food access during the pandemic. We're seeing just an increase in need in our existing partners. Many are saying, we were serving 100 people a month before, and now it's 200 a week. So the need has really skyrocketed, and organizations are stepping up to meet that need. But there's also a lot of new organizations and grassroots efforts, these community fridges I talked about that are popping up. That's just, a couple of friends who are saying like, hey, we should, we can just, my mom has a fridge that she's getting rid of, like, let's go plug it in here and we can, provide food for our neighbors. So those kinds of things are really incredible. But at the same time, it's just necessary. It's people doing it because they have to, because there's, not enough infrastructure existing to make sure that people have enough food to get by.
Yeah, and I have to say, it's at Made by Us, we work with a lot of Gen Z groups, for example, because that's our focus is serving young people. And I've really been so inspired to see so many young people really stepping up to serve, whether they're doing that out of like a throw our hands up that we cannot believe that there's not more assistance coming in and it's on us. I hate to see that kind of burden on young people, but they're doing it. Like the Zoomers to Boomers food delivery service that started at the beginning of the pandemic, to all of these initiatives that you're talking about. It's nice to know that, the next generation has got it covered. think we need to help them out, but it's definitely something I've noticed. So when we're heading into yet, another round of holidays in December for many people, holidays are certainly more than just food, and food justice is a year-round issue. But are you, Celia, expecting to see this awareness continue to increase through the end of the year?
Yeah, I definitely think it will continue to increase. I think this year, especially with rising food insecurity and it just being in the news a lot more, as more and more people are needing to use food assistance programs to get by. But I think it's always something that people pay more attention to during the holidays, because there's so much emphasis on food and, having these abundant meals during the holidays. And we're also reflecting on what we're grateful for and, spending time with family. And so we're more likely to be thinking about folks who don't have, access to have a big, Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner with family and friends. So, we often see at Food Forward and with other organizations, we see volunteer interest and numbers increase during this time, which I imagine might be a little different this year because folks' opportunities to volunteer in person are limited, or folks might not be able to volunteer or not feel safe. But as you mentioned, it's a year-round issue, and I think it's really important to always be aware of food insecurity as an issue. I also think it's important to kind of call out that, for me, one of the reasons that I think food insecurity has gotten a lot more notice this year is who it's impacting, right? So we're seeing people that we don't normally put in that category of needing assistance, needing to get food assistance. So we're seeing white people, college educated people, people who are more financially stable. But, for Black and Brown folks, for low income folks, for, single mothers, so many different marginalized groups, this has always been an issue. This is a year-round issue. So we're paying more attention to it now, partially because it's impacting more privileged groups. But it's really important that we recognize that, folks who are marginalized are always dealing with this, and it deserves, they deserve our attention, and this issue deserves our attention all year round.
Absolutely. So well said. Absolutely. I know we're getting a couple questions in on the comments, and if you're watching and you have a burning question, feel free to drop it in and we will definitely get to it. Ashley, just to circle back on what Celia was talking about, when you think about the history of these things and the holidays, I mean, the holidays take on some increased meaning no matter what the situation is. If we're at war, we're in another global pandemic, or whatever the case may be. How does that affect the way we eat or don't eat in the past?
Yeah, that's a good question. It really wasn't until after World War II that we've had this kind of era of abundance, for obviously not for everyone, but for some Americans, or many Americans, food has become more affordable post World War II. But if we go before World War II, we see that food insecurity, or just issues accessing food, was an issue across race, class, gender, socioeconomic status. And so when I look into the past and I see historic cookbooks, for example, say from around 1900, a lot of them were written for kind of a white middle class audience, but they have these very prominent themes of frugality. They have themes of how to use, say you're making a beef stew and you might use a piece of beef to flavor the stock. In some Creole cookbooks, they call that the bouillie. There's recipes for how to take that piece of meat that's been boiling for hours and repurpose it in another dish, recognizing that meat was expensive, right? Relatively so back in 1900 or in 1880. So looking back in the past, these kind of access to food has always been an issue. And the further back you go, food insecurity, as we would call it today, was more prevalent. That doesn't take away from the situation that many Americans are facing in terms of having limited access to food. These are issues we have to address with boldly and passionately, but they do stem from a historic just historic issues of struggling to access food. And so we still have a lot of work ahead of us.
That's really good. I also love that you're in your kitchen telling us about this. It's very suitable.
Surrounded by cookbooks, you know.
Yeah, exactly. I know. And historic cookbooks are just amazing. We have featured a few of these through Made by Us on our social media channels, and just it's incredible to see, you know, even things that get passed down from an oral history and then become, at some point, someone writes it down. It's fascinating. I know that people watching want solutions. They want to help, or they want to know where to go for help. Certainly is the case. So let's turn a little bit to what can people do? What can individuals do in their communities during the holiday season to advance the food justice cause? Celia, we'll start with you. And we did also have a related question from someone saying, is it better to donate money or canned goods, for example? So how can people help, Celia?
Yeah, so there are so many ways to get involved and help. I really want to encourage people to check out what's happening in your local community. You know, there are a lot of really great national organizations. Feeding America comes to mind, which works with a ton of regional, local food banks. But there's so much happening on the local level where you can really get more involved in your food system and make a real difference. So, you know, I encourage folks to do some research, see what food assistance programs are near you, and, you know, see what other opportunities there are. There are so many ways you can get involved with food justice in our food system. Maybe there's a community garden that, you know, you can volunteer at. You know, maybe there's a mutual aid program. Maybe there's, you know, a health-based food program, like Ashley mentioned, school gardens, you know, folks working with kids and families to you know, help them learn how to cook healthy. So there's so many different things that are going on all around the country. So see what really inspires you, and, you know, see how you can pitch in and ask what they need. I think the question about donating money or canned goods is a really good one. I think the best thing to do is ask or see what that organization is looking for. For some organizations, you know, going out to pick up canned goods or dealing with all those donations can be a real burden. So just money, you know, cold hard cash is easier because they can then decide how they want to spend it and do it in the way. But other organizations might have systems in place to do canned food drives. So that's a really great option for them. So yeah, I know we have some organizations that we're gonna put up to donate to and to get involved, but definitely, yeah, check out what's going on in your community.
Yes, I'll be sure. I'm going to show in a few minutes a slide. We have just some names of organizations. You know, you can't click through on our live stream here, but you can look them up. And we will also be pasting some of them into the comments as we discuss. So these are groups that Celia or Ashley has worked with, and, you know, other groups have recommended. Ashley, when you think about groups that you've worked with in your research, I mean, the food history weekend at the museum brings in so many different groups that work with food in different ways. And this year's theme was food justice. So were there stories that came up or groups that were part of that weekend, you know, that help us expand our understanding?
Most definitely. And, you know, I'm here in DC right now. I think of fairly well-known organizations like Martha's Table or DC Central Kitchen. But in my work with the museum, even prior to 2020 Food History Weekend, we actually started a really fantastic research project called Power Through Food. And this was a project that looked at women entrepreneurs, many of whom were migrants and refugees who have started organizations to support other migrants and refugees in their community. And so it's women-led, women-operated, and one of the examples is actually local here to DC called La Cocina VA. And the founder, Parifu Negra, is fantastic. She has started a workforce training program to provide Latinos in the Arlington area to train in the culinary profession, and then they have an internship placement program and help them secure jobs that are paying a living wage. And now they've started a new incubator program if these individuals want to start their own businesses and really take up the mantle of controlling their lives in every sense of the word, where they can start their businesses, learn how to get loans, learn how to create a business plan. But I will say during COVID-19, La Cocina Vieille has had to pivot dramatically because individuals who were previously enrolled in their training programs were struggling to get food on the table. And so they started providing direct donations to students to just help them get by and to go out into the local community, and all the food that they were preparing on site during training would be donated to community members in need. And so this is just one organization that I've really grown to admire and whom I've supported this year. I will say something I've done, and this is inspired by my boyfriend's grandmother, is this year for many of my Christmas gifts, I am making donations to a lot of these women-led organizations tied to food justice in the name of the person I would normally give a holiday gift to. And so it's a way to honor that person and let you know that they're thinking of them, but also to, help support organizations that are doing really important things right now. And so that's just one small way that I'm trying to help, in addition to getting the word out about these organizations, but it might be something that appeals to people looking for holiday ideas.
It's a great suggestion. And I'm going to go ahead and share our little list that we put together of just some organizations to check out, that we've worked with or that we know about. I know, so on Made by Us, which again is this coalition of many of the nation's history sites and museums and civic engagement organizations joining forces to connect younger generations with history as a tool for civic engagement. Our whole thing is sharing history that, comes to life in modern times. And I loved the mention here of the film Gather. We recently featured the story of Elsie Dubray on our Instagram. Every Monday, we have a series called Made by Us Monday, where we feature young change makers who are using history to shape the future. And Elsie's story is so amazing, and she's featured in the film Gather. She's a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, and she grew up on her family's buffalo ranch. And as a high schooler, she wondered if a shift away from traditional foods in her community was contributing to heart disease and diabetes in Indigenous communities. So she tried to find out. I mean, she did a deep dive research project into the lipid content, things I cannot understand, obviously, because she's way smarter than me. And she's, at the time in high school, into the content of buffalo versus beef and how these foodways affect health. And now she's on a mission for food sovereignty. She's, I think, a junior at Stanford University, and just a really wonderful story of someone taking a look at the past and seeing how it is already shaping the present and then using it to shape the future. So for me, that was a really inspiring story. And I know some of these other organizations that you put together here, Celia, and also Ashley, are doing similar work. I don't know if there's any you want to point out in particular, Celia.
Yeah, that's such a cool story, and I'm really glad you brought up food sovereignty, because I think that's such an important piece of this. And there's just some really incredible work being done by Indigenous-led organizations and individuals about, decolonizing our diet and decolonizing foodways, and really looking into how Indigenous foodways have been, sort of erased from our culinary history, and how these are amazing Indigenous folks who are kind of bringing that back. So one organization on this list, North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, is working to sort of dig into that history and educate folks and bring that back. Let's see, I'm trying to look at this list. I put on here Social Justice Learning Institute is an organization that Food Forward works with. They're located in Inglewood. They do a ton of work across education and youth leadership, but they do a lot of work with healthy eating and food justice. So they have over 100 community gardens that they've started. They do food distributions, they do healthy eating classes and healthy living classes. And they're really all about, empowering their community to kind of improve their situation with healthy living and lots of good stuff. Yeah, those are just some examples, but I think this is a really awesome list, and I think we can really look to Indigenous folks, Black and Brown folks who are really leading the way here on these issues of food sovereignty and food justice. And I'm also thinking about what Ashley said about frugality and sort of the history of that. That's also something that, we talk a lot at Food Forward about how to use up scraps and food waste recipes and ways that people can reduce their food waste at home. But those are things that a lot of marginalized communities have been doing out of necessity for generations. So, Black and Brown folks and Indigenous folks, that's just inherited knowledge of how to reduce waste and save. So, we can kind of present it as, here's a cool way to reduce your food waste, but we also have to, think about that history of that, where that comes from. So,
yeah. No, thank you for that reminder. Definitely. I am reminded, one of the sessions at the American History Museum's Food History Weekend, which was virtual this year, was about why food justice matters. And I don't know if you want to share more about this, Ashley, but to me, these speakers were just so wonderful and came from really, important backgrounds to lend a lens to this. Can you share more about that, Ashley?
Yeah, of course. And I think we have some details that we can share in the chat too, of all the names and organizations of the individuals who joined in. But, when I think about why food justice matters, for example, we invited people you might not even think of having on this panel, like John Gray from Ghetto Gastro. This is a art and food-based organization in New York City who is really trying to shake up and reverse these stereotypes of Black communities across the United States and really use art and food as a way to bring awareness to food insecurity, for example. And so that's an organization that has really inspired me with just the different modalities that they're getting this message out with. I would also point out Mau Organic Farms. This is a Native Hawaiian group. They have one of the largest certified organic farms in Oahu. And what's really fantastic about their organization is that it's a training ground where young interns, Gen Z, can learn Indigenous practices, but also how to manage the farm and become community leaders. The whole point is to get them to reconnect with their ancestral traditions and also prepare them to share that knowledge, to speak for themselves boldly and confidently through the work that they're doing at Mau. So that's an organization that I was really, really inspired by. We had two individuals, Tiara being one of the interns who actually came and spoke on the panel. And, she's all for it. She is going to be she's in college right now, but when she's out, she's going to be a change maker. And so I do encourage you all to tune into that recording. We do have it available. And you'll just see the passion that people, the passion with which they speak about these topics. But that's just one of the 4 deep dish dialogues that we had. They're all really moving, really informative. And I would encourage you to invest the 1 to 4 hours in checking those out, along with our cooking demonstrations. And speaking of food sovereignty, we had Chef Nico Albert, who is Cherokee, come and prepare sumac crusted trout for one of our cooking demos during Food History Weekend. And this is sumac that she harvested in her backyard. And it is a traditional ingredient with the Cherokee Nation, both in their homelands, if you think of the Southeast, but then also on their reservations now in Oklahoma. So it's a really important story of continuity. It's an important story of sovereignty and the removal of Indigenous communities from their ancestral lands and how they're trying to preserve and keep alive those really important traditions.
That's really wonderful. Yes, we're putting the links to all of these sessions in the chat. You can catch up and watch them. In a way, it's because it was virtual, everyone now has access to this type of conversation, which is something I think we're seeing that's one positive change or one positive result of such a really terrible circumstance, is that we can all pay attention to these issues that grip us. And we are in a national conversation right now about food justice. I mean, not just the three of us. I mean, the country is in this conversation where we're facing this issue more than we have in a long time. It has always been there, and many groups have been doing the work and have been leading the way, frankly, but it seems now to be really center stage at the national level, you know, in mainstream news outlets and things like that. And so I think bringing in both of your expertise to this conversation is so critical. And that's where the Made by Us network of museums recognizes that museums have a role to play here, because we convene people and we convene the context. And we need to be a resource for groups like Food Forward and for different advocacy groups or those working on the front lines of change to come use our stuff. So we have some good examples like online exhibits. The National World War II Museum has one that looks at the role of food in war. The California State Railroad Museum, it looks at, they have an exhibit called Farm to Fork, which is about how transportation affects food supplies across the country. What a good thing for the Railroad Museum to look at. And our partners at the University of Texas, San Antonio, Institute for Texan Cultures has a cookbook collection that they're digitizing 2,000 cookbooks. And they put out one that has, that's about recipes for the pandemic, essentially, pulled from all across history and all across Texas. Many, many different cultures are represented there. And even things like the Rare Breeds program at Colonial Williamsburg, which is about heritage livestock, but it's also about plants. So you have like these seeds that are passed down, ensuring that there's biodiversity. All of this just reminds me there is a role for every single person to play in building a just food future. Whether what you care about is, a breed of sheep or all the way up to cooking your grandma's recipe, or you really love trains. I mean, there is a way for everyone to plug in to figuring this out. So as we're wrapping up here, is there anything, I'm going to go to both of you, is there anything that you would like to leave our viewers with in thinking about their role in how they build a just food future? And Celia, we'll start with you.
Ooh, good question. I think, food, we've touched on a lot of different aspects of food justice. And I think that the first step is really to think about food and everything, every kind of holistic part of food, right? Where is your food coming from? Who's growing your food? How is it being produced? How is it being transported? Is it going on a train or, a truck or a plane or whatever? Like really, if you get really granular, and there's a lot of really great tools that can help you do this. You can figure out your food footprint. So similar to your carbon footprint, I know there's a website called Foodprint that has some really great resources, and you can look at, how much water is my diet using, how much land, all these different, environmental aspects, but also the, ethical implications of how your food is grown and how it's being produced. And then, thinking about the full life cycle of your food, right? So not only is it where are you buying your food and how are you cooking your food, but what happens once you're done eating your food? Are you eating all your food? Or, probably not. Most Americans, we throw some of our food away. We don't actually consume it. And that has, an environmental impact, both on the resources that are being lost in when we also waste food. And then the, when food goes to landfills, produces a lot of methane emissions, contributes to global warming and climate change. So, there's a whole scope. That's like a brief overview, but really we can get so granular on each of these levels. And I think it just starts with, like asking those questions and being curious. It can be daunting, but at the same time, it's really fun. And it's really, exciting to kind of get to dive deeper and look at your food in a different way, because it's fraught, like you said, Caroline, but it's also this really wonderful thing that connects us all. So yeah, I think it's about asking questions and being curious.
I love that. That's great. Ashley, what can you leave us with?
Well, I don't think I can really top that, which was the most beautiful kind of summation of what we should leave. So thanks for sharing that. I will say it's a takeaway that, I had going into organizing 2020 Smithsonian Food History Weekend, but something that I came away with even stronger. This idea that, we had so many organizers, community organizers, who are coming from communities where food access is an everyday issue. And they are of that community. They have experienced that hunger and are trying to carve a path forward. So I think my takeaway would be, if you're looking to support organizations moving forward this holiday season, take the time to look and see who is running the organization. Is it someone of that community, from that community, whose family is impacted by these issues, whose extended community network is really trying to deal with food access? Those are the people that you want to first and foremost support, because they know what their communities need. So, perhaps this holiday season, you can really focus on those grassroots organizations who can do some really impactful work with their communities. So that's just my small takeaway. But trust the people who've been dealing with this and who have been working for generations to solve these issues. They know what they're doing. Let's get out there together and support them if we are able. So that would be my 2 cents.
Fantastic. I mean, that is great advice. And I will just say, if you don't know where to start and you don't know what the food issues are in your community and you don't know who's affected, or you aren't sure who has been here doing the work, maybe check out your local historical society or your local history museum, because they do know, and they would love to hear from you. I know that is definitely true. Ashley, Celia, thank you so much for such a great conversation on food justice. If you're watching this live or later, we're putting all these resources and links in the comments below, so you can follow up on these groups, find a way to plug into the food justice movement, because it really is going to take people of all kinds with all backgrounds making it part of their work and bringing their strengths to it. So thank you both. And we wish everyone, a better, more just food future.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.